Okay, welcome everybody. I want to take a moment to introduce our guest speaker to you today. Brandy Keith is the Manager of Client Success and Engagement with SureHire. She has been with SureHire since 2013. With the ever-evolving industry trends and requirements, she has been able to support clients with implementing and managing their occupational testing services with her vast knowledge in the industry and by keeping up to date on occupational standards. She has had the opportunity to work with a variety of companies in various industries, such as oil and gas, construction, and transportation. Through in-person and web-based platforms, she has attended and presented at many industry conferences and facilitated various training programs, such as reasonable suspicion, drug and alcohol work rule guidelines, and cannabis awareness for organizations across Canada. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brandy, and for taking the time to be with us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. I'm looking forward to discussing the Canadian model standards and perhaps some drug and alcohol policy considerations that you could implement when potentially implementing this program within your own workplaces or even potentially adopting or adjusting current parameters you may already have in place. As Heather already mentioned, my name, of course, is Brandy, and I'm a SureHire here. I've been with the company in various different roles as well. However, more predominantly working very closely with clients, a lot of interaction with a number of different industries, whether that be transportation, construction, municipalities, so on and so forth. Occupational testing truly is a area that we do have some type of hand in any regard. So a lot of experience just in relation to working with a lot of various clients in terms of their policies, integration into completing the testing, ongoing testing, so on and so forth. So for the purpose of the session here today, I am intending on the materials covering roughly about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the latter half there just be available for questions and answers. So feel free just to put any questions you may have in the chat to address afterwards, or we'll kind of open up the room there afterwards if there's anything that anybody would like to address. Really briefly though, just to provide a little bit of context in terms of who SureHire is and what it is that we do. We are, of course, an occupational testing provider that was founded here in Alberta in 2005. Initially, when the company was adopted, it was the two owners there were physiotherapists by trade, and they had identified that there was certainly an ongoing trend within workplaces where a number of individuals were going in and getting employed with employers, and then very soon after getting injured and going on WSP claims and what have you. So they had identified that there was certainly a need for a program to be implemented to ensure that individuals could complete the bona fide occupational requirements of the role to ensure both the safety and well-being of the individual and the ongoing success of the company and them within it. From there, we certainly have expanded. So while it started with what we call our Fitness to Work program, we've adopted services such as drug and alcohol testing, audio being your hearing test, lung health programs for certain exposure programs like silica, coal dust, lead, asbestos. And then as well, we do some online training courses. So kind of on some of the materials we'll discuss here today, reasonable suspicion, again, workplace related trainings, medical services, background checks, and so on and so forth. While we were initially established here in Alberta, we have also expanded all throughout Canada and into the United States as well. So a lot of different industry experience based off of the different regions that we've serviced. As for the session here today, I did want to make sure that we're addressing what the Canadian model is and how it can be used within your workplaces. We'll discuss what the regulations and best practice guidelines outlined within the Canadian model are. I'll go over 9 keys to an effective policies and how those can need to be adapted potentially into your programs. We'll discuss the roles and responsibilities, both of the workers and supervisors. That'll be really crucial just in having a better understanding and context behind what the program really is when you are adopting those policies. We'll also discuss some alcohol and drug testing guidelines in terms of what type of testing can be done, what the cutoff levels are, what that means, so on and so forth, the different types of reasons for testing, and then as well, we'll touch on substance abuse expert or substance abuse professional assessments as well. First things first, we like to address, the importance of this policies being implemented within the workplace. Ultimately, whether you are at work or whether you're at home on your off time, Canadians of every age demographic are facing different pressures and stressors in their lives. Oftentimes, people take work home with them, they bring family life into the workplace, so on and so forth. And ultimately, over the years, we've certainly seen an increase in individuals turning towards substance use as a means of coping. Ultimately, when we're looking at these drug and alcohol programs, we are essentially trying to mitigate the use of those substances, but it's also just to be mindful that there's, of course, that mental health aspect or other sort of variables that may come into play as to what is considering a person being fit for duty versus those that may not be. So while, again, this is heavily focused on drugs and alcohol, just being mindful that there's typically a lot of contributing factors that lead a person to get to that point of potentially using substances. So any sort of platforms that you can have within your workplace to help establish and maintain a positive culture, resources, whether it be for substances or for other matters, would be very crucial. Looking here at this chart, this was actually put together by the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. So they took a look at a company that employed roughly 100 people. This was not specific to any one region or organization. However, of those, they determined that 76 of them may be consuming alcohol, 21 may be consuming cannabis, 14 may be using opioids. That could be things like oxycodone, for example. 2 may be using stimulants. That could be things like amphetamines. And then 3 may be using illegal substances, let's say cocaine, for example, in that situation. Now, this isn't to indicate that they're using it on these specific job sites. However, this is just to kind of indicate the sort of lifestyle that an individual may have and what they might be doing in their off time. As you can see here, the numbers don't add up to 100 and they do surpass that. Of course, with alcohol containing the large majority of those numbers. But again, bearing in mind that in relation to in relation to if somebody's using more than one substance at once, the effects of those could be exacerbated as well. In regards to these stats here, it wasn't looking at any one specific industry, it was just generalized data. So it's more of just a generalized information here. However, with that being said, of course, different industries, we've seen varying different feedback that's provided based off of these as well. So those within more so construction, oil and gas industries, they typically indicate that they would anticipate these numbers would be vastly larger within their organizations, where it may not be as much of a certain numbers may not be as much of a concern in other industries like municipalities, for example, things like that. But again, just being mindful that substance use within the workplace or within lifestyles is a very prevalent issue that oftentimes kind of going on behind the scenes or maybe going on behind the scenes. So let's chat about the Canadian model a little bit. So what is it and how is it used? Ultimately, the Canadian model is a best practice guideline that's available for employers within Canada to help mitigate the inappropriate uses of substances within the workplace. So it was heavily adopted initially from kind of Alberta practices with the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, otherwise known as COA, and Energy Safety Canada. Essentially, they had a number of individuals with various backgrounds in different industries, experience, and knowledge bases that came together to identify what these best practices are. So while in Canada, drug testing or these policies are not necessarily mandated in the same way you might see it in the United States, for example, where it's very strict and stringent, the Canadian model helps provide that foundation, the framework for organizations to adopt best practices as seen within workplaces, especially those that were heavily adopted in industries that it's more commonly used, such as construction, for example, to help kind of translate that across the field for other organizations and industries to adopt within their practices as well. The Canadian model, the more recent version is actually 6.1. It came out in May 2023. Prior to that, the more recent version was back in 2018. So the Canadian model will update and will adjust from time to time as different standards come about. However, with that being said, the standards are pretty tried and true and they've been around for quite some time. So we don't see a lot of changes as it comes to the Canadian model on a very regular basis. However, within that Canadian model, it will talk about the alcohol and drug guidelines. So within that, it's talking about work rules, what those work standards are. It discusses roles and responsibilities. So the way that they have it titled would be, that of contractors, owners, workers, and supervisors or leaders within the organization. It also discusses the need for education and awareness. So ensuring that individuals are informed as to, signs and symptoms of substance use, how to address those potential concerns within the workplace. They will also have a model alcohol and drug policy. It also discusses the alcohol and drug testing procedures. So both from what type of testing or methodologies may be used, such as urine versus oral fluid for drug testing, for example, as well as the expected cutoff levels per drug and the testing procedures that should be followed by the testing provider that you would elicit to complete this testing. So ensuring that they're following those proper chain of custodies and controls will be very crucial throughout this entirety as well. It'll also touch on the substance abuse expert assessments. So we'll touch on that throughout the session later here today to provide additional context. And it also has a guide for identifying safety sensitive positions. So just an available resource again to help those employers better identify within their policies who may fall under which category versus not. So let's look specifically at safety sensitive positions. Ultimately, when we're talking about drug and alcohol policies or substance use within the workplace, it is the expectation that regardless of your role, nobody is coming to work under the influence or impaired in any manner, as it will not be tolerated under any circumstances. That being said, the Canadian model does have a higher emphasis on those positions that are considered safety sensitive. And the reason being is that those are positions that have a larger potential for, a more significant risk of injury to either themselves, others, or the environment. And so the risk there is a little bit more heightened than you might see with some other positions. That being said, the Canadian model will also identify some other positions or structure of the positions that maybe need to be factored in. So things like non-safety sensitive positions, potentially safety sensitive, critical safety sensitive, or decision makers, for example. Now, of course, safety sensitive may be those that are those more have a higher risk profile for potential injuries or equipment damage, things like that. But it is also important to factor in those individuals that maybe aren't considered safety sensitive, however, may have a role where confidentiality is key, or they have access to very high profile information such as financial data, things of that nature. So those do need to be considered when you're implementing a policy, just to see if those roles would fit within the criteria for falling as under someone who may be subject to testing should an instance come up. Furthermore, on the right-hand side here, this is that resource that's available in the Canadian model. So it takes a look at the top of certain sort of work activities, as well as down the left-hand side, it takes a peek at different work environments. So organizations can essentially look at this, again, as a resource to either work their way down and over to see where a position may fall based off of the criteria that's outlined within this. It's again just a tool that employers can use to help better adapt what fits the needs of their organization specifically. While this model again is a best practice guideline, it is important to be mindful that you are able to make the appropriate adjustments based off of this foundation to best fit the needs of your organization. And we'll chat about that later on here, but just bearing that in mind as we work through the session here today. So let's take a peek at some keys to an effective drug and alcohol policy. So number one, it is really important that we are identifying the purpose of your drug and alcohol policy. So ultimately, typically the drug and alcohol policy is intended to prevent and mitigate the risks of impairment in the workplace and how to manage those situations if and when they may arise. However, the purpose should also take into consideration some of these following points here as well. So what goals will the policy help your company achieve? Is it intended is it being intended to be implemented to have a safer workplace, decrease injuries, create less downtime that are perhaps caused by accidents and near misses? So really honing in and looking at it internally, what is it within your workplace that may find value in having this policy adapted, and how can we adjust that policy and create it in a way that speaks to what your needs are based off of your organization? Furthermore to that as well, when we're taking a peek at the risks of workplace impairment, this is important when you are identifying that need for the drug and alcohol policy. Oftentimes it's looked at, of course, trying to mitigate those risks, certainly. You want to avoid any sort of employee injuries or death or property or equipment damage. But let's take a peek as well as to what sort of impact that can have on an organization from a productivity perspective. In 2020 alone, Canada was estimated to have about $49.1 billion in lost productivity costs due to substance use. That included both tobacco, alcohol, and opioids. So those are actually the leading causes of some of that productivity costs, and that had a significant impact within those workplaces. Of course, the program itself for the drug and alcohol policies can often have kind of a stigma that goes along with them, that it is intended on catching people and things of that nature. So having an effective rollout in terms of getting that buy-in from individuals would be very crucial as well. Oftentimes it's really about how it's being relayed. So ensuring that people understand that this is, ultimately to ensure the safety and well-being of everybody. It's not about catching people, but it is about providing the additional or necessary supports that may be needed within that individual, the workplace, the region, what have you. Furthermore, when we are looking at those risks of workplace impairment, you may even notice, an increase in absenteeism or sick leave. That could either be due to, regularly showing up late, not showing up at all, kind of changes in their behavior or performance deviations. There can even be increase in conflict and violence. That one's especially prevalent in certain substances, perhaps versus others. Cocaine is a good example of that, typically as it is a substance that will provide individuals a sense of superiority and confidence. They may come across very arrogant, condescending, have more of those violent tendencies. And then as well, just increase in theft potentially. And then overall, just that decrease in employee morale. So maintaining a positive culture in the workplace really does make a very big impact. So wherever we can try to make sure that that's being reinforced, we'll just have more buy-in from individuals as we are adopting or implementing or changing these policies. As well, it's very important that we're not ignoring or condoning certain behavior or potential issues within the workplace. Oftentimes, it can be challenging, especially when individuals have worked with other individuals for quite some time. Oftentimes, you spend more time with people you're working with than you may even in your home life. So, at times there is this misconception that people may feel as though they're doing someone a favor if they suspect something's going on, and they're just kind of putting it to the wayside, giving them easier tasks that day. But it is really important that we're being mindful that the longer we let something go on without intervention, the higher the likelihood there is of an issue at hand that could potentially create a very severe instance to come up. Apart from, that situation at hand, as a supervisor or a leader, if you are aware of something going on and you've not done something to intervene, there is the potential of a liability aspect being relayed onto yourself as well. And then even outside of that mental impact that it would have on yourself and others within that situation would long outstand the chain of events in that particular situation. So if you knew something was going on, you did nothing to intervene, and then something had occurred, that can have a very significant impact for a very long time. The second key here to an effective policy is, of course, to ensure human rights compliance. So we want to ensure that these policies are completed in a fair and just means while ultimately supporting the overall safety goals of your organization. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that in Canada, an individual's drug or alcohol dependency is considered a disability. And as translation, of course, there would be an employer's duty to accommodate in those situations where it has been identified that a disability is at hand. So In these situations, you are unable to terminate or deny employment based off of the presence of this disability. However, there are some S&P assessments and other actions that can be taken place should someone test positive or come forward to assist you in ensuring that you're complying with those standards and ensuring that that human rights piece is being factored in as well. So yeah, we want to make sure that we're being very mindful of that. But there are other means in which, you know, someone may come up positive on a drug test, go through the program, and it's actually deemed that they don't have a dependency, in which case there perhaps could be some additional or different disciplinary action that takes place based off of the outcome of those types of assessments. And we'll chat about those in a few slides here. The third one here is to outline the roles and responsibilities of supervisors and the employees. So it's really crucial that individuals understand what is expected of them and that they're aware as to what, you know, how that plays within their day-to-day roles and responsibilities. So if they, you know, a situation does come up, ensuring that they're aware as to what's outlined within their job tasks, the duties, and the chain of command that goes along with those. As is outlined within the Canadian model, when it's talking about the workers' roles and responsibilities, it indicates that workers need to have an understanding of the alcohol and drug work rule. They need to ensure that they're taking responsibility to ensure their own safety as well as the safety and well-being of those around them. Also ensuring that they're complying with work standards and that they're carrying them out in a safe manner. Of course, complying with the alcohol and drug work rule or policies. Use medications responsibly, so understand any potential side effects that may come up, and if there is any potential unsafe side effects, what are those expectations from them in terms of reporting that and disclosing it, and as well to encourage peers or coworkers to seek help if there's a potential breach of that policy or violation that may occur. As well, again, trying to really reinforce the overall safety component that's along with this versus trying to catch people. We want everybody to ultimately get home safe at the end of the day. Furthermore, from a supervisor's roles and responsibility aspect, there are a few here that kind of fall over from what the workers are expected of as well. But supervisors do need to be knowledgeable about and comply with your company's drug rule, procedures. They also need to ensure that they're complying with work standards and carrying those out in a safe manner. Also being knowledgeable about the use of alcohol and drugs to be able to recognize potential signs and symptoms. Understanding the company's performance management policy. So if there's any deviations from your policy, what does that mean? What sort of action does that supervisor need to take and what are the appropriate steps in doing so? Taking action on reported or suspected substance use. And then as well, one of the criteria is just indicating to complete supervisor awareness training in accordance with the minimum criteria listed here. So typically this would be, you know, a training program, either like a awareness training or reasonable suspicion training program, something along those lines that is educating supervisors on the signs and symptoms of substance use and how to action those particular instances should they arise. Having that education, that awareness would be kind of your first step in helping manage this program, especially in those situations where there's maybe a particular instance directly at hand that needs to be, you know, dealt with in an appropriate means. Moving on to the fourth one here. Sorry. Don't forget to address medicinal marijuana and prescriptions. So since legalization, there's certainly been a misconception within society, I guess I would say, where just because it's legalized, it no longer takes effect as it relates to a drug and alcohol policy. And the truth of the matter is that just is not correct. Medicinal marijuana use in general does still pose a very severe safety concern within the workplace. While people may not necessarily still be high, there can actually be impairing effects that last potentially upwards of 24 hours after the last use. So it does impair individuals or can impair individuals' ability to remember, concentrate, pay attention, and react quickly. So especially in those instances where maybe there's a safety sensitive role or perhaps somebody that has sensitive information, if they're unable to react quickly and appropriately in those particular situations, it can pose a very severe risk within the workplace. So just ensuring that the employer has clear language around what is expected of individuals within the workplace, both being employees, supervisors, so on and so forth. As well, it just assists in removing any uncertainty from the employee's perspective. So if it's clearly identified, there's just less room for individuals to essentially dispute what that may be within their workplace. So they have, the ability then to review the information firsthand, address questions or ask those questions when they're reading it, and then understand what is expected of them when they're going into the workplace. Apart from marijuana specifically, prescriptions is another one that does need to be considered. There are certain substances, while they may be taken for legitimate purposes, that does have an impact with or could have an impact within the workplace as well. So, for example, there are certain substances such as, let's say, amphetamines. Maybe somebody's been prescribed amphetamines for their ADHD. In those cases, when an individual is first getting prescribed that medication, there's generally about a 2 to 4 week time period in which it takes an individual to normalize to that medication. During that time, in those cases, it's typical that those individuals may have different safety sensitive side effects, things like being dizzy, exhausted, mood or behavior changes, things like that. So they do want to ensure that the appropriate accommodation is taking place during that time, should they have one of those prescriptions or something along those lines as well. So just being really clear as to what those expectations are will be a very crucial point as we're going through it. The next one here is, of course, to clearly state the reasons for testing. So ensuring that employees understand why, when, and how testing would take place will again assist in that initial buy-in and the proper rollout of these types of programs. It's also important to outline the circumstances that would be deemed testable. So for example, if an employer has a drug and alcohol policy in place in which post-incident testing is a situation that they may be tested under, it's important that the criteria around that is identified. So for post-incident, it may be, again, depending on the workplace or the specific policy, it might be that any equipment damage over $5,000 would initiate the employees within that incident to be tested, for example. Or it may identify specific instances from a post-incident comparatively to near misses and how they may differ when somebody might be tested versus when they may not be, things like that. So having those outlined within your policy will again provide a little bit more clear expectations and understandings. And then as well from a supervisor, HR, safety, whomever is managing those, it does better assist in properly identifying when it's appropriate to send somebody versus perhaps when it's not. And that just ensures consistency within your workplace as well. Typically within these drug and alcohol policies, it is really important that consistency is maintained, as that does generally assist in ensuring that, people aren't feeling as though a testing is just being requested because it's unjustifiable. If you can prove you're doing the same thing in each particular situation, it just helps reinforce your program and ensure that individuals are feeling more at ease about it as well, that they're not only being sent because there's some type of bias involved or things of that nature. Other sorts of reasons for testing can include things like pre-employment. So some organizations will adopt this where they're having an individual going for a drug and or alcohol test and must have a pass or a negative drug test come back in order to as kind of a condition of employment. Other instances may be pre-access. This would be instances where somebody needs to have a test come back cleared in order to gain access to a particular site. Those are typically those testing requirements are generally indicated by that particular site. So it may vary from one location to the next. Post-incident, as I mentioned, this would be cases where, after an incident had occurred, or depending on what criteria is outlined within your Canadian model, this may also include near misses. Reasonable suspicion or reasonable cause. This would be instances where somebody had reason to believe that somebody was under the influence while at work. So this is often where that education and awareness training really comes into play, where it helps helps individuals identify potential substance use on the workplace to help mitigate issues in real time. Follow-up testing would essentially be testing that occurs after somebody had previously tested positive and went through that substance abuse expert assessment, or has, been on a last chance agreement essentially within the workplace, where they may have to go in for X amount of tests over X frequency of time, let's say 10 tests over a 12-month period, to ensure that they're complying with standards. That follow-up testing would be essentially unannounced testing. So kind of like random testing, but with the rationale behind it as to, they previously tested positive, that's why they're on it. And then return to work is a more common one as well. This may be instances where somebody has been maybe off of work due to an extended amount of time based off of maybe an injury or something kind of going on in their lives. Maybe they took an extended leave. This could also be used in cases as a condition to come back to work if perhaps they've been laid off for a certain amount of time, and maybe that time period is 6 months, for example. So there is different means in which you can implement that within your policies to identify the criteria that make sense for your organization. The sixth one here is to identify consequences for employees who refuse testing or test positive. Again, we don't want to have to get to this point necessarily with having these policies. We want to help mitigate them before they get here. But it is important that employees are aware that they understand what consequences may occur should one of these situations come through. And as well, we want to make sure that the employees properly understand that and what their options may be should a situation arise. By being very clear about this and what those expectations are, it ultimately creates that transparency and helps to support that safety culture within the workplace. Again, it's really emphasizing that safety component to it. We don't want to catch people. We want to provide them the supports and the resources they need ahead of time to mitigate risk, but also to, better serve them in what they may require as well. And then typically, again, it may be variable depending on your policy, but more often than not, and as is recommended within the Canadian model, a refusal to test is often considered a positive result. So a refusal to test would be instances where either they straight up say they're not going to do that test, or perhaps they've agreed to the test, they've come into the testing provider, and then they don't consent to do the testing, or they leave partway through the testing. Those would all be instances in which would be considered a refusal to test. More often, as I was mentioning, this would constitute a positive result, and the disciplinary action would follow that type of result as well. So that is something that, again, the employee has the right to do. However, it is important that they understand what that means for them if that is the option they do select. It's also useful as well if you can kind of create a list of consequences that are accessible, visible, and easily understood. And as well, if let's say an instance comes up and then an individual comes back and says they weren't aware of that, it just assists in having that reference point when you're trying to manage these situations. And also just making sure that that's, like I mentioned, accessible for individuals so that they can refer back to that if needed, so they have a better understanding, again, for more heavily being adopted within the workplaces. The seventh key here would be to be clear about self-disclosure and accommodation. Ultimately, your policy should provide requirements for an employee to self-disclose. So this is kind of going back to whether an individual is using substances kind of on their own or if it's being prescribed. They do have that duty to disclose that to their organization to ensure that the appropriate accommodations can be put in place, either long-term or during that time while they're perhaps normalizing to medication. In some instances, it can be challenging, especially due to the scope of work, because some, physicians, when they're prescribing these medications, aren't aware as to the work environments that individuals may be placed in and the potential safety risks that could be associated with that. So ensuring that, everybody is aware and the appropriate accommodations can take place is, again, another means of being able to prevent potential risks that may not necessarily need to be there. As well, if an individual were to self-disclose or come forward to you, as an organization, you do have an obligation to assist them in seeking resources. So things such as, a substance abuse professional assessment or an SAP or a substance abuse expert assessment, SAE. Those situations are, those assessments, are individuals. Sorry, let me back up. Those assessments are completed by qualified professionals, typically that are either psychologists, addictions counselors, social workers, physicians, so on and so forth, that will essentially sit down with that individual who is either self-disclosed or tested positive to determine if they potentially have a addiction essentially at play, which if they do, it would essentially be considered a disability, in which case there's other means of accommodation that need to be factored in to the point of undue hardship. But in those cases, that SAP or that SAE would have an interview with the individual, asking them a variety of different questions. And then following that assessment, that SAP would provide a recommendation or a report there afterwards that would indicate what their level of dependency is. So whether they have no substance abuse, mild substance abuse, moderate, or severe. And then as well, they would indicate any sort of recommendations they may have in terms of treatment programs. Maybe that's AA meetings, counseling, a rehabilitation program. That may also be, certain testing parameters. So this would be where that follow-up testing may come into play, where perhaps the SAP recommends that they do 10 unannounced tests over a 12-month period after they've completed the recommendations in terms of counseling, potential treatment programs, things like that. And so this assessment is very crucial as it is assisting organizations in better determining what those next steps look like for that particular individual that this situation has occurred with. And then further to that, sometimes individuals aren't aware that they really do perhaps have an underlying issue at hand. And so this is often that first step in getting them potential assistance or back on track to where they may be ultimately wanting to end up in terms of, a different lifestyle, changing some parameters within their life, so on and so forth. So offering those assessments and having something in place is very crucial to make sure that you're ensuring the ongoing success of individuals throughout the duration of their time with you. And then as well, it may vary from provider to provider, but these assessments can either be completed in person or even a virtual format is also an acceptable means, so long as there's the video included within it as well, as the assessors are essentially taking a peek at different, answers they're providing for sure, but also looking at different physical cues that they may have, body language, stuff like that, as that kind of goes into the criteria that they're looking at when they're performing their assessments. The next one here is to identify how you will store results and what you will do to ensure confidentiality. So ultimately, confidentiality is key here. And the reason being, like any policy, is it also assists in ensuring that confidence in the program. It is really difficult for an individual to come forward if they don't feel as though this information is going to be kept confidential, and it may impact their kind of day-to-day interactions. So it's very important throughout the entirety of these processes that that's top of mind. It's also important to consider, who has access to results and in what circumstances. So from organization to organization, it may look different. Some companies may have just their HR team involved in requesting these tests, viewing results, having these conversations. It may also have safety included, sometimes in all instances, sometimes only in, let's say, post-incident or reasonable cause cases where they're more actively involved. So things like that, just understanding what that looks like, and in setting up with a testing provider, ensuring that those standards are being clearly identified as well. Also consider, how does your third-party administrator or TPA or your testing provider deliver the results to ensure that only the right people have access? So, with the day and age that we're in right now, it is really important that information is being relayed in a confidential and secure manner. So typically, sending that information via email is not recommended, just due to the potential with their personal information being kind of taken potentially if things are with all the cyber things that are going on, things like that. So oftentimes providers will have different databases in place where only designated individuals will have access to then see those results, view it, and make informed decisions on their part. And also consider how your TPA ensures employees' private and confidential information is protected through the chain of custody. So that's ensuring that the validity of the testing is taking place. There's no concerns with tampering with it. Also just ensuring that, the information is being maintained and retained for the amount of time that it should be. So of course, with different personal information, and just adhering to the different privacy laws and legislation out there as well, you want to ensure that those records are being retained for the applicable time and not too long, too short, so on and so forth. And as well, if you are pulling that data from that third-party administrator's database or whatever sort of format they're providing it in, it's important that you're storing it correctly on your end as well if it needs to be stored in employee files or what have you. The ninth one here is just to review and evaluate your policy. So review your policy regularly. This is really crucial, especially as your organization may change or grow or adapt. It's important to make sure that your policy is still adhering to the standards that you may see within your workplace. You also want to develop appropriate and measurable indicators. So ensuring that you know kind of where you need to stand with that, how you can appropriately evaluate your program to see if it does need any sort of changes. You also want to ensure that you're updating employees on any changes to the policy and sharing those regular reminders company-wide. So this doesn't need to be a policy you launch one time and then they don't see it again. So by consistently having that kind of top of mind, it will ensure that, it will ensure that the potential of employees are adhering to it more closely by remembering that it's there, understanding the expectations within it, things like that. And as well, having outdated policies does put yourself and the organization at risk. So we want to ensure that that's being completed on an ongoing basis, just to ensure that it's fitting your needs. As well, it's always recommended to have legal counsel review your policy before you're launching it, especially to ensure that you're adhering to those, human rights compliances and things like that to make sure that these are being handled in the appropriate means. That'll also just ensure that it's most appropriately fitting your organization. As I mentioned previously, the Canadian model is a great guide and it's providing that foundation and that framework. However, there are pieces, because it's not mandated, that organizations can adopt to best fit their needs. So sometimes it's not a one size fits all, but that foundation is going to be really crucial to kind of getting it off the ground. And then ultimately, a good policy is a foundation for a successful program. And it just helps keep your organization, meeting your safety goals and adhering to the ultimate intent that you have behind launching it to begin with. In terms of testing, there's a few different methods that are available out there. Within the Canadian model, it does recognize both urine and oral fluid testing, excuse me, when it comes to drug testing. So within that, it does recognize what's considered a point of collection test or an express test. That's essentially a quick dip test when it's a urine test where it's providing that same day qualitative result. It's essentially indicating something was negative, meaning nothing was detected, or something was non-negative, meaning something was detected in the system. In those cases, the Canadian model indicates that express testing can be used as a risk mitigation tool, but ultimately the gold standard test would be a lab-based test. Reason being is that it's providing that quantitative results that would provide court admissible test results as well. The only drawback is that those do typically take about 2 to 5 business days at the lab for that analysis to occur. Once that analysis takes place, if something is detected in the system, we're able to identify how many nanograms per milliliter of that metabolite and analyte is available within the system. So, for example, there's different cutoff levels for each drug. Let's say THC or cannabis. On a urine test, it'd be 50, so 50 nanograms per milliliter. So if it's at or above that level, that is what would essentially indicate a positive test, and then there'd be further analysis that would take place, and then they would test it at a lower level looking specifically at those analytes of that metabolite to break it down more specifically. So it just does assist in determining how much is really in their system. As well, each drug does have a cutoff level in place. So we're not testing things at a zero tolerance stance. So for example, we often get questions as to how to ensure that secondhand smoke for THC, for example, isn't making their test come up incorrectly. And the truth of the matter is those parameters are in place to help determine those types of situations or kind of take them out of the equation. If somebody's cutoff level within their system was at or above that level, they are likely receiving the same sort of outcome as this person that may have been smoking, for example. Now, should a sample be considered positive at the lab, the standard practice is to have that reported to a medical review officer or an MRO, who is essentially a licensed physician who's qualified in reviewing prescriptions and determining how they translate to that lab result that came back. So essentially what they'll do is they'll review that lab result and they will contact the participant directly to see if they have a valid prescription for the substance that came up in their system. And further to that, ensuring that they're taking it as prescribed. So if they have a valid prescription and they're taking it appropriately, then those results ultimately will be relayed back as a negative. However, if they don't have a valid prescription or the levels in their system do not correlate with the amount that they were prescribed, meaning that there's more in their system than what's prescribed, then those results will come back as a positive, and that's the information that would be relayed to you as an organization. So in terms of drug testing, there is urine, oral fluid, or hair testing. Urine and oral fluid are the most commonly used methods of testing. Urine typically has a more historical time frame. Urine usually has a more historical time frame, but it is a highly reliable and valid test. So it's been very heavily adopted within workplaces. It is a little bit more challenging when it comes to urine testing, just as it's more easily adulterated, meaning that people can try to tamper or cheat their test. However, there's different parameters that providers, SureHire specifically has in place as well that helps determine individuals that may be trying to tamper with their test. So if somebody was trying to tamper with a test, we have 3 different logs that we may place them on. A collection log would be an instance where an individual has testing criteria that falls outside of what we consider normal ranges. So when we're doing the testing, we're looking at everything from the color, temperature, presence of bubbles, creatinine, nitrates, pH, glutaloride, specific gravity, so on and so forth. So if it falls outside those ranges, or if there's any suspicious findings, then we would put them on that collection log and have them provide another sample until it does fit the criteria. This ensures that we're receiving a valid sample and it's not something tampered with. We also have dilution logs. So if this person's system is essentially too watered down, or what's called a flush kit or a detox kit was used, we'll have them provide another sample as well. Again, by doing these checks on the front end, it just better assists when or if it goes to the lab, just as they're also doing those checks. And it's nice to know, this information prior to a couple of days down the road. That way we can kind of make sure we're getting a valid sample right off the hop. And then in some instances as well, there are individuals that, kind of get white coat syndrome. They're a little bit, nervous about coming in for this type of testing to begin with, or they're just not able to provide sufficient amount of a sample. So in these cases, again, we would provide them additional time to provide another sample until it does meet the criteria that we require. On the flip side, we do have oral fluid testing as well, which is also a great alternative. It's also recognized within the Canadian model if you're doing the lab-based option, because it's providing a closer link to more recent usage. So it typically, depending on the drug, is detecting usage in the last 24 to 48 hours, whereas urine testing could detect usage up to 30 or so days, specifically for THC, just due to the way that it works within their system. In terms of oral fluid, though, it's a little bit more easily collected, less invasive. The only drawback really with that testing option is that express or that POCT test, that same day result option is not a very reliable option out there. So it's not recommended. And it's also not recognized within the Canadian model, even as a risk mitigation tool. So again, just something for employers to be mindful of. When we're talking about the Canadian model and the recommended drugs, it's also discussing the drugs that should be tested for and that they would advise. So that would be inclusive of cannabis, cocaine, opioids, including, codeine, morphine, oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, amphetamines, methamphetamines, and PCP. Otherwise, when we're looking at alcohol testing, most often organizations will do a breathalyzer, which would be similar to what those may see roadside, where essentially they're blowing into the tube and it's spewing out their BAC or their blood alcohol concentration level. If that number is at or above your company's cutoff level, we'll wait 15 minutes, do a confirmation test, and then that confirmation test, whatever the outcome of that one is what the final result will be. So the Canadian model recommends a 0.04 level for alcohol. So if your company were to adopt that, and let's say somebody tested at 0.04, that would essentially indicate as a fail on the alcohol test. And these, the machines that are used as well are evidentiary machines. So they are fully accurate and there are no concerns in terms of the accuracy when it comes to those. So they would be and they would be able to be used in court should a situation arise as well. And then just briefly on that testing process. So what it would look like, somebody would request a test, that collection would be performed. Should it go to the lab, it would go through the GC-MS analysis. If it's still detected in the system, then it goes to the secondary analysis at the lab. And then from there, again, if it's still positive, then it goes to that medical review officer interpretation to validate the potential prescriptions an individual may or may not have relating to what was in their system. And then that was all that I had here. Let me just see.
Hi, Brandy. We do have a question in the chat.
Yes.
If you don't, I can just read it to you. So it says, in your experience, at what point does your duty to accommodate an employer for their disability, time off for rehab? I'm not sure if you answered this already. Exceed the responsibility grounds for termination, repeat incidents, second chances. How could you put this expectation into a DNA policy that says how many times you can accommodate reoffenders for their disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry, I guess I have it shared up there anyway. Perfect. So in this case, ultimately it will vary based off of the company. It does make it a little bit challenging for employers though. However, with that being said, again, it'll vary depending if you're adopting the Canadian model standards or you're kind of going off on your own and adjusting those a little bit differently. So legal counsel would likely be advisable just to make sure it best fits your needs. However, with the Canadian model recommendations, it's essentially indicating that typically, individuals should be coming forward first. If they don't, the potential for disciplinary action could be up to and including termination. However, again, if that situation comes up where it's considered a disability, then you do have that duty to accommodate, as was mentioned. In these cases, oftentimes, once they've tested positive and they've gone through that SAB, they're typically inputted or placed on a last chance agreement. And in those cases, should they test positive on their follow-up or any potential future testing, generally in those cases, then that would kind of be that point of potential termination should everything lead that way. So oftentimes it's not a consistent means of always having to then put them back on that program because it's disability. As long as you've done your due diligence to ensure that they're being offer the resources, go through the program, assist them as much as you can. There's only so many times you can keep allowing them to keep testing and still, maintaining their position within the company. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And I know there's been a couple of questions. If you're willing to share your slides, I know we're recording the video as well, but so that's something that's been requested. Does anybody else have any other questions? You can either unmute or pop it in the chat.
And I can definitely send out the presentation as well thereafter, just to keep a peek at, especially when you're potentially adopting or adjusting a program. It's hard just to remember things that went on, so I can definitely share those.
Okay, thank you so much, Brandy. That was super insightful. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a
Awesome.
question.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Um, if you change your drug and alcohol policy like midway through someone's employment, is there any problem with implementing now a testing standard? Like we have drivers and we haven't had a testing policy, but it's something that I'd like to add. But in the past, I thought that there was something where you had to have it upon hire in your policy. Is that the case?
Yeah, I may defer to legal counsel just to be specific to that or your organization. However, generally speaking, in terms of what we've seen before, if let's say you start to initiate pre-employment testing after they're already hired, typically they are grandfathered into the program. However, if they fall within that safety sensitive role, they may have grounds for potentially falling within that post-incident reasonable suspicion program, for example, if that's the parameters that you're looking to initiate. The biggest piece to that would be ensuring that they're aware of the policy and have signed off on it. Typically though, yeah, if it's employment testing and they're already an employee, you couldn't use that. You could then initiate them to go for one of those tests and determine their employment from there. But typically if it's relating to those safety related practices, like let's say the follow-up or post-incident reasonable cause, and that's where you have more grounds to be able to initiate those even after their employment has started. And that's the situation your company is then adopting. We've worked with lots of organizations as well that have had like just recently created or implemented a program within their system that they didn't previously had. And it's more about the, launching of that as well within their system, making sure that it's effectively understood, created, fits the needs, and it's clearly identified those particular instances like you mentioned.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kaylee?
Hi there. Sorry, I had to step out for a quick moment, so I apologize if you've already answered this. For post-incident testing, we're in Fort McMurray, so obviously a lot of our testing facilities are used to site-specific requirements. Is there a standard kind of type of panel or the types of tests that you would want to capture on a post-incident test?
Yeah, so by most organizations, and not everybody follows it, but most organizations are doing what we call an 8-panel. So it includes like THC, cocaine, opioids, amphetamines, and PCP. Some organizations will go a little bit more in depth and include more prescription medications as well, where it includes those same ones, but it'll also detect things like barbiturates, propoxamine, benzodiazepines. Oftentimes, I would say like oil and gas situations, we see more of like those 13 and more extensive panels being done, but the 8-panel is the most heavily adopted that we've seen for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. I see a question here just in regards to have you found it if there are any complications with DNA testing with the union environment? I will say it's a lot more difficult to launch those programs just to ensure that it's meeting those standards. However, we do specifically work with a number of unionized workforces. Oftentimes, it's about looking at those testing methodologies that best fit that unionized workforce. Most often, I would say that we're seeing those companies or those unionized workforces using more so the oral fluid testing versus the urine testing, just because it's more closely linked to more recent usage and doesn't feel as though it's as much of an infringement on people's lifestyle or things that they do in their own time. So that is what we see. Not every unionized workforce, of course, does adopt that. So I would say it's probably a little bit more challenging as there's a little bit more red tape to walk through in those cases. But it's not uncommon for unionized workforces as well to adopt and implement these programs. Again, I think it ultimately is coming down to how it's being relayed in terms of launching these programs. So making sure that, again, we're not trying to catch people, we are trying to ensure safety and well-being. And if that's appropriately communicated, I think there's a little bit more buy-in that comes along with that if it has a successful launch.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandy. I know we're coming to the end of the lunch hour here. So just have some comments with great information and thank you. So we really do appreciate your time and for coming back after our some tech issues last time. So we really appreciate your time. It's great.
No worries. Thank
So
you so much.
we could just stay on for a couple more seconds. I know people have to leave, but if anybody else has any questions, feel free to ask. I did have a question. I'm just wondering how many, like if you have many K to 12 school boards, if you hear that have drug and alcohol policies.
Yeah, I would say it's not, I don't hear of it as much as you might see in other industries. I think that there's certainly could be value in still having those, but I think it's not the first industry that comes to mind in terms of launching those. I think perhaps it could also be too that it's maybe not safety sensitive in the sense of like operating machinery, but of course you're working with youth and things like that. So there are other factors that need to be considered when it comes to that. But even social service instances, stuff like that. We've worked with some of those types of groups as well for these programs. So not as common out there, but yeah, just the long of it, I guess, is that we don't see it very much, but we do have some that we've worked closely with as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
for answering that. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us as well. And keep an eye on your email for the slides, and then we'll also have this posted on our Asia website. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandy.